there's so many topics I want to explore with you, and I know we don't have 5 days. But one of the things that we share in our businesses is that we are dealing with international families often, which is often the case with wealth, is that it ends up crossing boundaries and jurisdictions and so forth. For us, there tends to be an American in there. I suspect you probably have a few in what you do as well. But to what extent does this conversation change when you get outside of national boundaries in talking about families and talking about culture and talking about kids that are maybe, born in one country, grew up in another one, parents from different places? How does that add to this conversation?
Well, I think what you're talking about is TCKs.
Yes.
Third culture kids. So the concept that you're growing up in a culture that's different to one of your parents. And we can add so many layers to that, because actually you can have one parent from one culture, another from another. You're growing up in a completely different one. And then there's the added also culture, which is maybe your parents grew up in a working class background and you're growing up in an affluent one. That in itself is a whole other culture. I should also add, there's the other culture of digital, without digital and with the digital, growing up with that fluency. So it absolutely does change it. You have to be very sensitive and very careful about entering those systems, as I would call it. When I said the family's always in the room, if you're my mentee and your father is Indian and your mother is Japanese, but you've been brought up in the UK, how do I work with you? I have to take all of that into consideration, and the family has to be in the room. And the reality is you may be returning to one of those countries or where the family business is at some point. So I also need to prepare you for some of those culture shocks that your parents think are normal, but you've not actually grown up in.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's such an important topic that is an undertext often, is a subtext often, but it is not overtly raised, discussed, dealt with and probably not everyone knows that term, so it's useful to have it be front and center in the process.
One of the best parenting pieces of advice across the board is it's all about calm response, follow through on the consequence. Not big reaction, feel bad, don't follow through on the consequence.
That's big. No, really.
Yeah.
That's big. And I think hearing it makes sense. That feels like that's a potentially difficult behavioral change for people, right? Because different personalities react to stress, conflict in different ways. But I can intuitively feel, as you say that, why it would be beneficial. And then I can imagine that being really easy or really hard for people of sort of just different personality types.
Absolutely. And I think it's really hard for the parents that I work with who are very busy and who travel a lot. And part of that guilt response is, I don't want to follow through on this. I've taken away your phone. And let's be honest, young adults and teenagers, if you take away your phone, you're going to hear about it. You don't want to hold that. You want to relinquish it back to them. But the best thing to do is to just, keep to it. And I use this word lightly, but they have to feel that suffering, because actually the most resilient young adults that I've worked with, be that from, middle class or ultra high net worth families, are the ones whose young adult years better resembled the real world. So they were prepared for it. The ones who were very sheltered and then had this very rude awakening were the ones who really struggled. So I've got young adults who are from very big, well-known families who had to work on the shop floor when they were 16. They had pocket money, they had a budget. If they did something wrong, there was a consequence, and it followed through. And yes, they kicked off, and it would have been hard to maintain it as a parent, but the results really, came through in the end.
And that's the point, right? It's process and result, right?
Exactly. I'm saying as a parent, I don't always follow through on myself. So, but,
Yes.
We can try. That's all it is.
It's directionally what we should be trying to do. I think that's the messaging that people want to hear. So let's spend a few minutes talking more about the emotional aspect of all this. We've talked about how important that is. It's a large part of the work that you do with clients. And there's so many sort of emotional laden terms that get attached to this topic and this kind of conversation. inheritors being entitled, inheritors feeling shame, being motivated or demotivated, or all of that, right? There's a wide range of things here. And I suspect it's true that there's not just a single set of emotional aspects that, everyone's different. They have different expressions of that. But what can you talk about in your experience around that emotional range? I don't know if there's such a thing of what's normal, or not normal, or how do you start to tackle it? The emotions are a big issue.
I'm glad you brought it up, because it is the word and it's the phrase that people are uncomfortable with. Is there space for it? But ultimately, we're human, so it doesn't matter if you're the director of the company, the child that's going to inherit that. That company is full of people. It's humans with human emotions. So we do need to talk about it, not just within the family context, within the business context as well. And also as client relationship managers, wealth managers, you will have your own emotions as well. So they're always in the room. We would say. Now, to talk about some of those titles, those words, entitled, let's start with that. That's a tough one. When a parent says to me, I have a really entitled teenager, I want to say, but I don't always, which is, who entitled them? Typically they don't entitle themselves. Now, that behavior or narrative can absolutely take a life of its own. But, it's just about making sure there is a balance. I have so much empathy and understanding for parents when maybe they didn't have as much when they were younger. They've then become very successful, and they just, best intentions. They want their children to have the best.
Have it all.
They
Absolutely.
do, yeah. And it comes from a place of love and giving, and it's not, there are no bad intentions. However, the outcome can be the entitled child. So you have to be careful with that, In terms of shame, absolutely. If you haven't, how do I put this? The wealth creator, first generation, they don't have any shame related to the wealth typically. I've not seen it yet. Don't know if you have. No, they're the opposite. They're proud. This is what they've been working for. If you are receiving that life, but you don't feel like you've done anything to deserve it, there's almost like a survivor's guilt element to it. How am I living like this? Why me? Why did I get this? I've had young adults who have done everything from refuse extra time in exams when they are dyslexic or have ADD, for example, because they've said things like, I have too much, I can't take any more, to ones who will wear their shoes until there are holes through the bottom. And I'm saying, please go and get some new shoes. They just really, as a reaction to the identity that they've been given, have said, well, I'm going to go the other way. I reject this. So there is that aspect. It doesn't help, if we're frank, that the outside world often shames the group. So while they feel shame, well, it's kind of understandable when you've got everybody pointing a finger and going, well, you're bad, or you hold the golden chalice for everything that would sort out all of my problems. How dare you be ill, or how dare you be unwell? I know they're big topics, but they are real. I would say the number one, when we're coming back to this topic of emotion, which is just to state that it's there, is the main thing. To go, you have a legitimate need and for support. This is a legitimate area and reason to have these feelings. They're allowed. That's number one.
I'm so glad that you say that so unequivocally, because my perception is that a lot of people tackle this as a to-do list, right? Teach this person about credit scores, teach this person about having a credit card, teach this person about investing, introduce them. And it's sort of this very sort of mechanical, knowledge-based, experiential mission without really addressing that emotional side. So I'm really glad to hear you say it so emphatically.
Well, for about 8 years now, since I started Dallington, the first question I will always ask a young adult from a family like this is, how does it feel to be a member of this family? They've never been asked it. The shoulders come down. Oh gosh, I've got to answer that. I don't, how does it feel? Because I've been told it should feel really good,
We've been talking a lot about wealth, family wealth, wealthy people, etc. We haven't really defined wealth. often when we're talking about family businesses or prominent families or reputational burdens, that's suggesting very, very wealthy families. And we deal with some of those, but we also deal with a lot of people who have, just a few million, and don't think of themselves as wealthy, but have these same questions. What do I do with my kids and so forth? And it feels like they should be included in this discussion and in this topic, even if sort of the rest of the world doesn't always think that they should. Are they your clients also? And how much of what we've been talking about applies to the sort of merely wealthy as opposed to the uber wealthy?
Yes, so they are my clients, and I wish to add that is very much, it's a journey, isn't it? So a family who are early stages of wealth, let's say, usually are on the journey because they want to create more wealth. Now, the wealth may be a side of that. I think we should come back to that definition question. But like I said earlier, it's about the progress. It's about the build. They're building a company or many companies, and the wealth is a byproduct of, or the money, let's say, is a byproduct of that. But when it comes to defining wealth, I think that's a very important but also personal question. Because if I asked you, George, how do you define wealth for you? What would you say?
Well, I'm highly enlightened. It would be about, my emotional status and my service to the world, obviously. No, I'm sort of joking.
But I'm sure there's a part of that is true.
But there's a peace of mind aspect to it, which is in part how you feel about things, but is a part resource-based, right? If you have enough resources that you can make choices, don't have fears, there's clearly a financial part of, feeling secure that is tied to, that concept of I'm wealthy, I'm happy, I'm secure, etc.
You've hit the nail on the head. People can have a hell of a lot of money and have no wealth. Wealth is that more holistic peace of mind, which is, and balance, dare I say it, which is, yes, you do have that financial aspect, that comfortability. You're not maybe looking over your shoulder anymore, but with it, you've also got peace of mind. You have purpose, you know where you're going.
So this to me is always just a big surprise when you're sitting across the table from someone who has an enormous amount of wealth and they don't feel wealthy. They feel concerned, they feel anxious, they feel uncertain. They don't feel wealthy because they don't have that peace of mind aspect to it. So I think this is such an important aspect to sort of being clear about.
Well, you're absolutely right. I can't tell you how many times I've had parents, but typically more mothers, and that's interesting why they've said this, say, we've never had so much money and been so concerned about it, and said, and also felt so poor at times because they have so many more outgoings. I would say that's because they have invested heavily into understanding and employing the best financial advisors, tax accountants, legal teams. They have taken care of the money. They haven't taken care of the emotional under the surface part. And that needs to come. Now, people like you and your company are doing that. This is what this is about. Absolutely. But everybody needs to be doing it, They have to go hand in hand. I often say this, parents are typically very good at preparing the money for the child. They're not so good at preparing the child for the money. That is more of an emotional journey and education.
That feels like a bumper sticker or a t-shirt.
Yes.
By the way, parents, prepare the child for the money, not just the money for the child. That's like an iconic, Yeah, I like that. Before we leave this, I imagine, probably incorrectly, that this topic is potentially easier when dealing with families with just a bit of wealth, if we can use something like that, versus uber wealth. It feels like uber wealth brings on, so much more around reputation, and because the wealth creators created so much wealth, it's an insurmountable burden for them. Whereas someone that is just a bit wealthy, just a couple of millions, whatever we're going to call that to be, is that less of a burden? Does it make this whole thing easier in some degree? Do you see that being different when you're talking to that rising gen cohort? Is it harder for them when they're uber wealthy or is that just a fantasy on my part?
No, I think it's a really fair question. Look, there's a reason why all the big banks have their different categories of programs for their clients. Some will be in the high net worth, and then you've got the ultra high net worth, and so on and so forth. And they are kept separate.
Yeah, they do have different.
They have different needs. Yeah, absolutely. That said, when it comes to these kinds of conversations, I think it's very much down to the individual. You know, I've worked with families who have a few million. I've worked with families who are billionaires. And actually, it's often the ones who are billionaires I'm sitting around their kitchen table with them with, you know, my shoes off, and we're having a really calm chat about this so that I can deliver the information for them to deliver to their families. Whereas I find maybe the younger wealth, maybe you could call it that, or the newer wealth, really look to advisors to guide them. You know, and maybe that's something about their infancy in this new role and culture.
I can imagine that in that first case, there's so much wealth and it's been around for long enough that there's a comfort with it. Even though you know you may not be doing it perfectly, there is an element of comfort with it. There's a recognition that you can make some mistakes and it's all going to be fine. And you have the time and resources to sort of sort it out. Whereas if it's maybe a lot less wealth, newer wealth, there's less comfort, less familiarity, more uncertainty, less room for error in some way. I hadn't thought about that, but I can see what you're saying there. Yeah, that's really interesting. So broadly, I think we can say this discussion has been about thinking about how to raise sort of well-rounded, thoughtful inheritors of wealth. And there's lots of issues around that, only some of which we've been able to touch on. But one of the things we haven't talked about is, you know, some of the specific issues that people struggle with in that role that are unexpected. I think things like, you know, shame or things like entitlement are somewhat expected, but I suspect there are things that people would be surprised to hear that people in those roles are experiencing. Can you share, you know, an example or two of things of issues that people in that role are experiencing that people might not be expect that they would experience?
I think the number one thing that I've seen over the last 15 years now is that young adults from these families, from these legacies, are lonely and isolated.
But they have family, they have jobs, they're living in the world, right? Lonely.
Let's think of it more as maybe an isolation, okay? So if you are a son of X, daughter of Y, it could be hard to make friends in your first term, let's say, of university. You go to Freshers' Week at university. Now, it's a nightmare now because everyone's got social media so they can look you up. What if you just want to be you? You don't want to walk in and everyone has decided who you are. Or worst case, which I have had, which is the local newspaper has already printed that you are going to that university in advance of your arrival. Your response to that might just be to pull back, you know? Save some of yourself. So what I see on one end is that some of these young adults are quite isolated because they choose to be. They choose to restrict themselves from opening up to some of that, those challenges that face them, people assuming who they are, also being targeted, you know, financially, emotionally. I want to be friends with him or her. I'm going to have a great Christmas. We're going to have a wonderful spring break. It happens. You know, one of the first things I check for with some of the younger adults that I work with who are living independently for the first time is, who's in your social group? Who's picking up those checks? You know, it's important. It's not to say that you shouldn't now again, but a balanced amount. Right. You should not be covering that for people, because what does that say about the basis of your friendship or relationship? Yeah, right. A lot of young people I know have never brought their friends home. Do you know? Not because they haven't got lovely parents and a lovely home. Again, they're scared. What are people going to think? Exactly. And the way they talk about it is that, you know, they could be living in a awful bedsit in a dodgy part of town, but it's the opposite is true. But they just really want to be valued for themselves. And again, that always comes back to the identity piece. TCKs, third culture kids we were talking about, they're also quite isolated. If you've moved many times, on the one hand, the young adults who have done that are very resilient. They can pick up, get into a new school system, get into a new job, learn a new language. They're fab like that, very independent. But when it comes to making friends, well, I've had to say goodbye to, so many in these really informative years where, as we remember, being 18, 21, your friends are everything, So if you've had to repeatedly leave those groups, you might just stop trying. So there is that added aspect as well.
That's interesting. And hearing you say that triggers a thought I don't think I've clearly ever had before, but it's almost the inverse of what you're describing. And I remember living in Miami and living among very wealthy families. And all of them seemed wealthy until they were compared to the next one that was really, really wealthy. And then suddenly these kids that had really everything they needed and, in one social circle were, standing above and almost outside of, as you're describing. In a different social circle, suddenly they were sort of the poor cousin. They didn't have the yacht. They only had the nice house or what have you. So it almost goes in both directions, depending on what that social circle looks like.
Absolutely. Completely agree. People just having they have their perception of who you are. And if someone has decided who you are for you, you can go two ways. You're either going to rebel against that, and that might not be good either, or, you just retreat from it. So I think in this work, in my line of work, or anybody else who is doing this sort of work, it's so important that there's a space where you are understood for you, that your challenges and opportunities are understood, but that also there is a group element to your work. So whilst I may be working one-to-one with somebody, at some point in the work, it's very much about saying, okay, let's find you peer mentors, other people in your position, maybe a few years older than you, who you can actually find to develop a friendship with. And that's not for me to be involved in. I'm not in that situation. This is for you to have for yourself. And so we really try to help them set that up and have that group element.
Fantastic. In the context of finding some means for having wealth conversations across the family, one of the areas that I know we talk about a lot, we think about a lot, is philanthropy, because it's something that seems to be an easier first conversation about the family's wealth, or about wealth issues, or about money issues, or what have you, about what the money's for and the impact you can have with money. And it allows a lot of these conversations to have with a little less of the burden of, I'm going to inherit this piece of money and what that means, and some of the things you've been talking about. I know you're not a financial advisor. That's what we do. But I'm curious your perspective around if you have seen that in these family dynamics as a positive part of the conversation, as one of the pathways to try and have these sort of joined family conversations around wealth. And if not, that's fine. But I'm just curious if you've seen that be a helpful part of trying to have that engagement.
Definitely. I think what you're saying is the conversation. That's really important. The conversation where they're together and they discuss aspects of, gaining perspective. That is really important. Philanthropy does that. I think going to another country and another culture and giving your wealth without those conversations falls short. That's where I have seen it. Where a young adult doesn't really understand about the need for philanthropy, hasn't been educated on it, but once a year will go to a completely different country, different culture, and is shown how their wealth and how their money is benefiting and helping that community, let's say. Yeah. That's wonderful. That really matters. That's so important. I'm so glad it happens. But if that isn't being preceded and having conversations around, it's not just a one-off event, it's about the process and why it's important and why you as a future leader, because like it or not, you do actually have impact and you're going to have impact in the future. Mm-hmm. So I think the ongoing education around philanthropy is what's really needed as well.
That's helpful. That's good perspective. We talked earlier about the idea of allowing kids to fail. One of the things I think either I read from you or heard in a prior conversation was this tension between using money as a control versus sort of teaching kids how to have money, setting limits. I think there was something you were talking to parents about in terms of, what do the kids cost and so forth. Can you talk a bit about that tension between letting them fail and using money as a control and that?
I think what you're talking about is boundaries, really. Yeah. And we have lots of boundaries in life, but one of them is money. And, there should be boundaries. And if you gave a 16-year-old unlimited credit cards, you'd learn quickly that they will push those boundaries. So it's about, from a fairly young age, explaining what these boundaries are, giving somebody an inch, hoping they don't take a mile, but like I said before, having consequences if they do. So I sometimes do this exercise when we get round the table with a family, because even though I'm working predominantly with the young adult, we always get round the table with the whole family when we can. Now, one of the questions I ask is to the young adult, do you know what it costs to run you?
That's great.
George, do you know what it costs to run you?
I do.
Good. That's important that you do.
I'm cheap, though.
Most young people, regardless of their financial status, at some point won't know. Of course they shouldn't. And it's important they don't. They have a childhood. They shouldn't be worrying about these things. But as we get older and older, we should start to understand what it costs to run us and what things are essential and what aren't. Now, when I ask a young person, what does it cost to run you? And I ask the parent, neither know. That's what's important,
Okay, right.
And
is there a big difference in the guessing? Is there like a huge gap?
No. The parent usually can work it out pretty quickly when they think about it, but the young adult, absolutely not. Of course, they don't take into consideration that running them also means that private education, transport, psychological support, the legal frameworks that go into setting up their trusts, all of those things. No, and why should they know that at a certain age? But when you're getting into that sort of mid-20s, 30s, you should know what that is. So it's quite a fun exercise in some ways. It's quite alarming. You suddenly also see parents trying to bring that number down a bit if possible. But it's also about saying to a young adult, if you want to maintain this lifestyle and you want to do this with your own agency and with your own money one day, what does that mean about the choices you're going to make? Because the parents will have had to have made those choices. Okay, I want to live in this kind of house. I want this kind of lifestyle. These are the certain jobs or industries I'm going to enter into.
It's funny how that gets manifest in a lot of our work. We'll have a cash flow model for the client, the family, the spending, et cetera, sort of with current costs, expectations for future costs and wealth and how that all plays out as a base model. And then we'll run scenarios off of that for various things, retire, start a business, whatever it might be. And inevitably, some of those are around how long and to what extent I'm supporting the various kids, right? Do I keep paying for their apartment in London, their apartment here, et cetera, and so forth? Do they go back to school? There's some big hit for that. Do they get married? All of these scenarios you start to run that rarely have a binary outcome. It's not usually, in this case, you're fine. In this case, you're eating cat food. It's not usually that stark. Yeah. But it does have an effect in terms of the feeling they have around their wealth and cash flows and outgoings and things we've touched on. And then beginning to be intentional about it. Having specific conversations with the young adult kids about what support should be, what that will look like, how long, in what form, as opposed to sort of what's just been, deal with everything as it comes. So that it starts to become really specific, intentional, structured conversations around what does it cost to run you.
Yeah, and they're really, like I say, these don't have to be difficult conversations. They should just become normal conversations that people can have.
We've spent some time talking about what parents can do behaviorally for themselves, using external resources to try and be more successful in engaging the inheritors of wealth, usually they're rising gen kids. I'm wondering if there is something you can suggest that is really unexpected in terms of a way to motivate, galvanize sort of positive outcomes that's more than just sort of a thou shalt do, thou shalt not do kind of perspective, which I think has been helpful. And you've given some recommendations for external reading, all sorts of things. But as a final thought, is there sort of a big picture, maybe slightly left field recommendation you can give parents of wealthy inheritors to try and have a better positive outcome for their kids?
Foster big ideas. Super important. If you're the child of a successful parent who has created a lot of wealth and has a successful business, be that a product or a service, the chances are you think, I'm never going to be able to create something or think of something that's as important or as impressive as what they've created. Not the case. You've got to really take it on yourself as a parent to, even from that toddler age, really foster those crazy, wild, imaginative ideas. Because not only, yes, it might turn into something, it might not. That's not the point. It's the process of actually being with them, knowing that actually there's something they can teach you. That's so important in a relationship, in a parent-child relationship. But it allows them to think, you know what, it's not just about the money. Having these big ideas does have value. It does have impact. And so I'd always say that, foster big ideas.
That's fantastic. I love that. And I wasn't expecting that. That's really great. Well, we should probably wrap up since we've been talking for 8 or 10 days now, it feels like. And I think we could easily go on for at least that much more. And frankly, this is just the start, right? This is a start of a necessary conversation that we are having with clients that, frankly, everyone who is in an advisory position with people of wealth should be having with clients. And, hopefully it leads to something more. I don't know if we'll eventually do maybe a live version of this where people can be in the room and we can have sort of live conversations. That might be nice, but we've really appreciated and enjoyed having you share your perspective, give some really specific, both positive and sort of negative warnings and opportunities for people to actually specifically engage with their kids. So thank you for coming and sharing that with us.
Thank you so much for having me.